Welcome to this journey into the darkest corners of forgotten American history. I'm your guide through the archives that time tried to bury, and today we're traveling back to the summer of 1920, to a place that no longer exists on any map, a place where the boundary between science and superstition blurred beyond recognition. Before we begin, I want to know, where are you watching this from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. There's something uniquely unsettling about sharing these stories across different times and places, connecting us all through the darkness of the past. The year is 1920. The Great War has ended, leaving America transformed but traumatized. The Spanish flu has just loosened its grip on the nation, having claimed more lives than the war itself. In this atmosphere of death and uncertainty, rural communities across the South cling to old ways, old beliefs, and old fears that modern cities have long abandoned. One such place is Willow Shade, Georgia, a town of approximately 800 souls, nestled in the humid lowlands between Savannah and Augusta, surrounded by decaying cotton plantations and endless stretches of moss-draped swampland. Willow Shade in 1920 was a town suspended in time. No paved roads connected it to the outside world. The railroad had bypassed it 2 decades earlier. Communication with the county seat required a full day's journey by wagon. The townspeople lived as their grandparents had lived, farming. The same exhausted soil, worshipping in the same whitewashed church, burying their dead in the same cemetery that held Confederate soldiers from a war that still felt recent to many. It was in this isolation, in this place where modernity had not yet arrived, that something unspeakable began. On the morning of June 3rd, 1920, Reverend Jonathan Whitmore climbed the stairs to his daughter's bedroom to wake her for morning prayers. Sarah Whitmore, 19 years old, known throughout Willow Shade for her beautiful singing voice and plans to attend teaching college in Atlanta that fall, did not respond to her father's knock. When Reverend Whitmore opened the door, he found his daughter lying motionless in her bed, her white nightgown pristine, her hands folded peacefully across her chest. For a moment he thought she was simply in deep sleep. Then he noticed her skin, pale beyond natural paleness, with an almost translucent quality in the morning light streaming through the window. He approached the bed. He touched her hand. It was cold. What Reverend Whitmore saw next would shatter his faith and his sanity in equal measure. On his daughter's neck, just below her left ear, were 2 distinct puncture wounds, each approximately 1 centimeter in diameter, perfectly circular and penetrating deep into the flesh. The surrounding skin was bruised a dark purple, but there was no blood, not on her neck, not on her nightgown, not on the white sheets beneath her. The Reverend's screams brought his wife and the household staff running. By noon, Sheriff Thomas Caldwell stood in that bedroom, staring at a scene that defied every instinct his 15 years of law enforcement had given him. The windows were locked from the inside. The door had been bolted. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints, no indication that anyone had entered or left the room during the night. But there was one detail that would haunt Sheriff Caldwell for the rest of his life, a detail documented in his official report filed with the county on June 5, 1920. A report that would mysteriously vanish from public records 3 years later. Sarah Whitmore's body, according to the preliminary examination by Dr. Marcus Holland, contained no blood whatsoever. Not a single drop. To understand what happened in Willow Shade during that terrible summer, we must first understand the town itself, a place that existed at the margins of the modern world, clinging to traditions and beliefs that the 20th century had not yet touched. Willow Shade was founded in 1823 by plantation families seeking fertile land along the Ogeechee River basin. By the 1850s, it had grown into a modest but prosperous community of cotton growers. supported by the labor of enslaved people who outnumbered white residents 3-1. The Civil War devastated the region. Sherman's march to the sea in 1864 left most of the grand plantation houses burned to their foundations. The largest of these was the Blackwell Estate, a sprawling mansion owned by Dr. Silas Blackwell, a physician who had studied in Europe and returned to Georgia with peculiar ideas about medicine and mortality. According to the Savannah Morning News archives from 1887, the Blackwell mansion burned under mysterious circumstances on the night of October 31st. Dr. Blackwell, his wife Catherine, and their 3 children perished in the flames. Local folklore claimed the fire started in the doctor's private laboratory, where neighbors reported seeing strange lights and hearing disturbing sounds in the years before the tragedy. The ruins were never cleared. By 1920, they stood as a crumbling monument on the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown gardens and ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss, a place children were forbidden to approach after dark. The Willow Shade of 1920 was a shadow of its former self. The population had declined steadily since Reconstruction. Young people left for cities like Atlanta and Savannah, seeking opportunities the exhausted cotton fields could no longer provide. Those who remained were largely elderly farmers, their families, and a handful of merchants and craftsmen who serviced the dwindling community. The town's social structure was rigid and predictable. At its center stood the Willow Shade Baptist Church, a modest white building with a tall steeple visible from every corner of town. Reverend Jonathan Whitmore had led the congregation for 23 years, preaching a stern but compassionate gospel that emphasized hard work, family values, and the eternal struggle between good and evil. His wife, Margaret Whitmore, ran the town's only school, teaching 15 children in a single-room building behind the church. Sheriff Thomas Caldwell represented the law in Willow Shade and 3 surrounding townships. A tall, weathered man of 45, Caldwell had served with distinction in the American Expeditionary Forces in France, returning in 1919 with shrapnel scars and memories he refused to discuss. He brought a methodical, almost scientific approach to law enforcement, unusual for rural Georgia. He kept meticulous records, insisted on evidence-based investigation, and maintained correspondence with criminal investigators in larger cities. His daughter Lucy, 16 years old, helped him organize his files and dreamed of becoming a lawyer, an ambition that raised eyebrows among Willow Shade's more traditional residents. The town's small medical needs were served by Dr. Marcus Holland, who had arrived in Willow Shade in March 1920. Holland, 52, presented himself as a retired physician from Boston, seeking a quieter life after losing his wife to influenza. He was educated, articulate, and carried an air of cosmopolitan sophistication that made him simultaneously respected and slightly mistrusted by the locals. He rented rooms above the general store and established a small practice, treating everything from farm injuries to childhood ailments. Other notable residents included Henry Blackwood, the 40-year-old owner of the general store and grandson of one of the town's founding families. Father Patrick O'Brien, the Catholic priest who served the small Irish immigrant community that had settled in Willow Shade after the war, and Esther Moon, an elderly black woman who lived alone in a cabin near the swamp and was widely believed to possess knowledge of herbs, roots, and other remedies passed down from her grandmother, who had been enslaved on the Blackwell estate. Life in Willow Shade followed predictable rhythms. Sunday church services brought the community together. Saturday afternoons saw farmers gathering at Blackwood's store to trade news and supplies. Children attended school from September through May. The social calendar revolved around harvest festivals, Christmas celebrations, and Independence Day picnics. But beneath this veneer of normalcy ran deeper currents, superstitions that had survived generations, beliefs in signs and omens. whispered stories about the old days. Many older residents remembered the tales their grandparents told about the Blackwell mansion, about Dr. Silas Blackwell's obsession with extending human life, about the strange ailments that afflicted workers on his estate, about bodies found drained of blood in the months before the Great Fire. These stories were dismissed by younger, more educated residents as Gothic nonsense, relics of an ignorant past. Sheriff Caldwell himself had little patience for superstition. Dr. Holland openly mocked such beliefs as peasant foolishness. But Esther Moon, when asked about the Blackwell legends, would only say, "Some things don't die just because we stop believing in them." The spring of 1920 had been unusually wet, turning the surrounding swamplands into a maze of stagnant pools and thick vegetation. The summer arrived early and brutal, with temperatures climbing into the high 90s by late May. The heat pressed down on Willow Shade like a suffocating blanket, making sleep difficult and tempers short. It was in this atmosphere, isolated, superstitious, sweltering under an oppressive sun, that Sarah Whitmore became the first victim. But she would not be the last. The official autopsy of Sarah Whitmore was conducted by Dr. Marcus Holland on the afternoon of June 3, 1920, in the basement of the Willow Shade Baptist Church, the only building in town with a room cold enough to preserve a body. During the summer heat, Sheriff Caldwell attended, along with Reverend Whitmore, who insisted on being present despite Dr. Holland's strong objections. The medical report, a copy of which was preserved in Dr. Holland's personal papers and later donated to the Georgia Historical Society in 1974, contains details that even today defy rational explanation. Sarah Whitmore's body weighed 31 pounds less than her recorded weight from a medical examination conducted just 2 months earlier. The weight loss corresponded almost exactly to the average volume of blood in an adult human body. External examination revealed the 2 puncture wounds on her neck, each penetrating approximately 4 centimeters deep, severing the left carotid artery with what Dr. Holland described as surgical precision. The wounds showed no tearing, no hesitation marks, no indication of struggle. Internal examination revealed complete exsanguination. Every major organ showed the pale, deflated appearance, consistent with total blood loss. Yet there was no blood in her stomach, no aspiration into her lungs, no pooling in her body cavities. The blood had simply vanished. Most disturbing was Dr. Holland's observation of Sarah's facial expression. Despite the violence of her death, her features showed what he termed peaceful surrender, eyes closed, lips slightly parted, facial muscles relaxed. It was, he wrote, as if she had willingly accepted whatever befell her, or perhaps had been unable to resist it. Sheriff Caldwell's investigation began with interviews of everyone who had been near the Whitmore home on the night of June 2nd. The results were frustratingly inconclusive. Margaret Whitmore testified that she had checked on Sarah at approximately 10 o'clock that evening. Her daughter had been reading by lamplight, preparing for bed. She appeared healthy and in good spirits, excited about her upcoming journey to Atlanta. Mrs. Whitmore bolted Sarah's door from the outside, a nightly ritual the family had maintained since a break-in attempt years earlier. The bolt could only be opened from the hallway side. Reverend Whitmore confirmed that he had gone to bed at 10:30 and heard nothing unusual during the night. The family's housekeeper, an elderly woman named Ada Cooper, stated that she had secured all the ground floor windows and doors before retiring to her own quarters at the rear of the property. Thomas Perry, a farmhand who lived in a cabin 50 yards from the main house, reported seeing a light in Sarah's window around midnight. He assumed she was reading late and thought nothing of it. He heard no screams, no sounds of disturbance. Sheriff Caldwell examined Sarah's bedroom with meticulous care. The window remained locked from the inside, the old-fashioned hook-and-eye latch firmly in place. The door bolt showed no signs of tampering. There were no footprints on the floor, despite the fine dust that had accumulated during the dry weeks before the recent rains. Sarah's bedside lamp had burned down completely, suggesting she had been alive for several hours after her mother's visit. The only unusual detail, and Sheriff Caldwell noted this in his report with obvious reluctance, was a faint, sweetish odor in the room, which Dr. Holland could not identify but described as vaguely medicinal, perhaps chloroform or ether, though neither substance leaves such a lingering scent. The town buried Sarah Whitmore on June 5, 1920. More than 300 people attended the funeral, representing nearly every family in the county. Reverend Whitmore, broken by grief, could barely speak the eulogy. The official cause of death, as recorded on her death certificate, was listed as acute exsanguination due to unknown trauma. For 10 days, Willow Shade existed in a state of shocked mourning. Sheriff Caldwell continued his investigation but found nothing. Dr. Holland privately theorized that Sarah might have suffered from an extremely rare blood disorder that caused spontaneous hemorrhaging, though he admitted this theory failed to explain the puncture wounds. Then, on the night of June 13th, it happened again. The second victim was Elizabeth Hayes, 23 years old, a seamstress who lived with her widowed mother in a small house on the eastern edge of town. Elizabeth's body was discovered by her mother on the morning of June 14th, in circumstances nearly identical to Sarah Whitmore's death. Elizabeth lay in her bed, pale and lifeless. 2 puncture wounds marked her neck just below the right ear. Her room was locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle, and, as Dr. Holland's examination would confirm, her body contained no blood. But this time there was a witness. Elizabeth's mother, Martha Hayes, told Sheriff Caldwell that she had awakened around 2 o'clock in the morning to a sound she could not quite describe. Like wind moving through the house, though no windows were open. She had risen from her bed and noticed a strange, flickering light beneath Elizabeth's door, like candlelight, but moving, dancing across the floor. She knocked. Elizabeth did not answer. Martha tried the door and found it locked. She called her daughter's name. Silence. Growing frightened, she fetched an axe from the woodshed and broke through the door. By then, whatever had been in that room was gone. Elizabeth lay dead in her bed, the same peaceful expression on her face that Sarah Whitmore had worn. Martha Hayes told the sheriff something else, something he included in his report despite his obvious skepticism. She swore that as she broke through the door, she glimpsed something moving past the window. A shadow, she called it, but a shadow with substance, tall and thin, darker than the darkness itself. When Sheriff Caldwell examined the exterior wall beneath Elizabeth's window, he found marks in the soft earth. Not footprints exactly, but depressions in the soil, as if something heavy had rested there. The marks led away from the house toward the old Blackwell Estate ruins, then vanished in the dense undergrowth. By June 15th, panic had begun to spread through Willow Shade. Families bolted their doors and windows. Men sat up through the night with loaded shotguns. The town's small Catholic church saw its first overflow crowd as people who had never attended Mass suddenly sought Father O'Brien's blessings and holy water. On June 16th, a farmer named Jacob Miller reported that 3 of his chickens had been found dead in their coop, their necks punctured, their bodies drained of blood. The same pattern appeared on 2 neighboring farms over the next 3 days. Sheriff Caldwell called a town meeting on June 18th. More than 200 people crowded into the Baptist church. The sheriff stood at the pulpit and attempted to maintain order as voices rose in fear and anger. "We're dealing with a murderer," Caldwell declared, his voice steady despite the chaos. "A man, a human being, who is using fear and superstition to cover his crimes." But an elderly farmer named Silas Crow stood and shouted what many were thinking. "This ain't no man, Sheriff. This is what old Dr. Blackwell brought upon us. This is his curse, come back after all these years." Esther Moon, the elderly herbalist, spoke from the back of the church, her voice cutting through the noise. "Y'all should have listened to the old warnings, should have torn down that mansion and salted the ground. Some evils don't stay buried." Dr. Holland tried to inject reason into the discussion, explaining that exsanguination could result from various medical conditions, that the puncture wounds might be the work of a disturbed individual with medical knowledge. His words fell on ears that had already made their decision. The meeting ended with no resolution, only deeper fear. That night, Sheriff Caldwell sat in his office, reviewing his notes by lamplight. His daughter Lucy brought him coffee and asked the question he had been avoiding. "Papa, what if they're right? What if this isn't something we can arrest?" Caldwell looked at his daughter, saw the fear in her eyes, and for the first time since the war, felt truly helpless. "Tell us in the comments what you think is happening so far. Is this the work of a human killer hiding behind superstition? A medical phenomenon we don't yet understand? Or something that defies rational explanation? Share your theories. We read every comment, because what happened next in Willow Shade would test every theory, every belief, and every boundary between the possible and the impossible. Between June 19th and July 2nd, 1920, 5 more victims fell to whatever stalked Willow Shade. Victim 3, Robert Chen, 28, the son of Chinese immigrants who ran the town's laundry service, found dead on June 21st. Same wounds, same bloodless corpse. His father discovered him, and in his grief began spreading a theory among the immigrant community that this was the work of a Jiang Shi, a hopping vampire from Chinese folklore. Sheriff Caldwell dismissed this as cultural superstition, but the detail disturbed him. The Chen family had recently arrived from California and knew nothing of Willow Shade's history or the Blackwell legends. Victim 4, Daniel Yates, 31, a war veteran who had returned from France with shell shock and lived alone in a cabin near the swamp. His body was discovered on June 24th by hunters. The condition was identical to the previous victims, but this time there was additional evidence. Daniel's diary, found on his bedside table, contained entries from the week before his death. The final entry, dated June 23rd, read, "It came to my window again tonight. I can see its shape in the darkness. It whispers my name. I know I should run, but I cannot move when it speaks. Tomorrow night I will let it in. I'm so tired of being afraid." Sheriff Caldwell kept this diary entry confidential, showing it only to Dr. Holland. Both men understood the implications. Either their killer had somehow gained psychological control over his victims, or the victims were experiencing shared delusions before their deaths. Victim 5, Anna Schmidt, 42, a widow who operated a small bakery, discovered June 27th. Victim 6, Michael O'Sullivan, 19, nephew of Father O'Brien visiting from Savannah for the summer, found dead June 30th, despite the protection of holy water and crucifixes Father O'Brien had placed throughout the guest room. Victim 7, Grace Porter, 26, a school teacher and friend of Sarah Whitmore, July 2nd. 7 deaths in exactly 1 month. All exhibited the same characteristics: puncture wounds, complete exsanguination, locked rooms, no signs of forced entry, peaceful expressions. The victims ranged in age from 19 to 42, included both sexes, crossed racial and religious boundaries. The only commonality Sheriff Caldwell could identify was that all victims lived alone or in rooms isolated from other household members. Dr. Holland documented every autopsy with increasing frustration. He wrote to colleagues at Harvard Medical School and the Boston City Hospital, describing the cases without revealing the location. Their responses ranged from skepticism to accusations of hoax. One professor suggested Holland was suffering from tropical fever delusions and should return to Boston immediately. By early July, Willow Shade had effectively shut down. The general store closed at sunset. No one ventured out after dark. Families slept in groups, maintaining constant watch. Farmers abandoned their fields. The cotton that should have been tended rotted on the stalk. Sheriff Caldwell organized armed patrols, groups of men who walked the town's streets throughout the night, carrying lanterns and shotguns. On the night of July 3rd, one such patrol, led by Henry Blackwood, reported seeing a figure moving through the ruins of the Blackwell mansion. They fired several shots. The figure vanished. When they searched the ruins at dawn, they found no body, no blood, but they did discover something else. A staircase, hidden beneath decades of debris and overgrowth, descending into darkness beneath the mansion's foundation. Sheriff Caldwell descended those stairs on the morning of July 4th, 1920, accompanied by Dr. Holland, Henry Blackwood, and 3 other armed men. What they discovered would remain officially classified until 1963, when portions of Caldwell's sealed report were finally released to the Georgia State Archives. The stairs led to a network of tunnels, not natural caves, but deliberately constructed passageways with brick walls and vaulted ceilings, extending beneath the Blackwell estate and branching out toward the town cemetery and the old slave quarters. The air below was cool and dry, preserved from the humidity above. The tunnels led to a series of underground chambers. The first contained shelves lined with glass jars, most broken, their contents long since decomposed. Labels, still partially legible, indicated various chemical compounds and biological specimens. Dr. Holland recognized some as medical preservatives common in the mid-19th century. The second chamber served as a library. Wooden shelves held hundreds of books, many damaged by moisture, but many more remarkably well preserved. The collection included medical texts from the 1850s, volumes on anatomy and surgery, but also darker material, treatises on alchemy, medieval manuscripts discussing blood and vitality, and multiple copies of obscure European texts dealing with immortality and the prolongation of life. It was in the third chamber that they found Dr. Silas Blackwell's laboratory. The room stretched at least 40 feet in length, with a high ceiling supported by stone arches. Along one wall stood a row of metal examination tables, their surfaces stained dark despite decades of neglect. Surgical instruments lay scattered across a large wooden workbench, scalpels, saws, devices whose purposes Dr. Holland could only guess at with growing horror. But it was the wall of journals that drew their immediate attention. 73 leather-bound volumes, arranged chronologically from 1851 to 1887, containing the detailed notes, observations, and experimental records of Dr. Silas Blackwell. Sheriff Caldwell and Dr. Holland spent hours in that underground chamber, reading by lantern light, uncovering a story that would challenge everything they thought they understood about their case. Dr. Silas Blackwell had studied medicine in Vienna in the 1840s, where he had become obsessed with the emerging field of hematology, the study of blood. His journals revealed a brilliant but increasingly disturbed mind, driven by a singular goal: to conquer death itself through the manipulation of blood. Blackwell's early experiments focused on transfusion techniques, attempting to replace the blood of dying patients with fresh blood from healthy donors. These experiments, conducted on enslaved people on his plantation, resulted in numerous deaths. But Blackwell viewed these failures as necessary steps toward his ultimate goal. By the 1860s, his journals showed a dramatic shift. He had become convinced that blood contained not merely physical sustenance, but something he termed vital essence, an energy or force that degraded over time, causing aging and eventual death. If this essence could be extracted from young, healthy individuals and introduced into aging bodies, Blackwell theorized, human life could be extended indefinitely. The Civil War provided Blackwell with unprecedented opportunities. His journals from 1863-1865 described experiments conducted on wounded soldiers, both Confederate and Union, who were brought to his estate. He developed increasingly sophisticated methods for extracting blood while keeping his subjects alive as long as possible, believing that blood taken from living subjects retained more of the vital essence than blood from corpses. One entry from November 1864 read, "Subject 17 expired after 6 hours. Total extraction 4.3 liters. I consumed 2 liters immediately. Effects: temporary increase in vigor, heightened sensory perception, marked decrease in joint pain. Duration: approximately 18 hours. Note: larger quantities may produce more sustained effects." Dr. Blackwell, it appeared, had begun consuming human blood. The journals from 1865 to 1887 documented his descent into complete madness. He claimed to have discovered the optimal method for extraction: 2 precise punctures into the carotid artery, administered while the subject was in a state he called voluntary surrender, achieved through a combination of chemical sedation and what he termed mesmerism or hypnotic suggestion. He described the effects of regular blood consumption: enhanced strength, slowed aging, heightened senses. He wrote of walking abroad at night, of entering locked rooms through methods he never fully explained. He claimed to have recruited others to his cause, people he had transformed through his blood rituals. But by 1887, his writings showed paranoia and fear. He mentioned being hunted, described enemies gathering against him, wrote of preparations to preserve his work for future generations. The final journal entry, dated October 30th, 1887, one day before the fire, consisted of a single sentence: "If I cannot have immortality, then let me have eternal recurrence. The blood remembers, the blood returns." Dr. Holland closed the journal and looked at Sheriff Caldwell in the lamplight. Both men understood the implications, even if neither wanted to speak them aloud. Somewhere in these tunnels, Silas Blackwell had attempted to preserve himself, or worse, had succeeded. The investigation of the underground chambers continued for 3 days. Sheriff Caldwell and Dr. Holland catalogued everything they found, photographed the journals, and made detailed notes. They discovered 2 more rooms, one containing what appeared to be a primitive surgical theatre, complete with restraints and drainage systems built into the floor, and another that seemed to serve as living quarters, with a bed, personal effects, and, most disturbingly, a calendar that had been marked through November 1887, a full month after the fire that supposedly killed the Blackwell family. On July 7th, they sealed the entrance to the tunnels and posted guards, intending to return with experts from the state capitol. Sheriff Caldwell made the difficult decision to keep the full details of their discovery confidential, fearing mass panic. He told the town only that they had found evidence suggesting a medical lunatic, possibly someone who had discovered the tunnels and was using them as a hiding place. That evening, Sheriff Caldwell returned home exhausted, his mind reeling from what he had witnessed beneath the Blackwell ruins. His daughter Lucy had prepared dinner. As they ate, he assured her that they were close to solving the case, that the killer would soon be apprehended. Lucy asked if she could visit her friend Clara the following morning. Caldwell agreed, reminded her to be home before dark, and retired to his study to write his report to the county authorities. When he checked on Lucy at midnight, a habit he had developed since the murders began, her room was empty. Her window stood open. The bed had not been slept in. On her pillow lay a single white flower, a willow shade blossom, the plant for which the town had been named, and beneath it a note written in handwriting that was not Lucy's, in ink that appeared dark red in the lamplight. "She has come willingly, Sheriff, as they all do. The blood calls to blood. Come to the cemetery at moonrise tomorrow if you wish to see her again. Come alone. Your weapons will not help you there. The official record of what happened in Willow Shade after July 7th, 1920, is frustratingly incomplete. Sheriff Thomas Caldwell's final report, the one he was supposed to deliver to county authorities, never arrived. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation file on the Willow Shade murders, opened in July 1920, was sealed by executive order in March 1923 and remains partially classified to this day. What we know comes from fragments, scattered documents, personal letters, photographs, and testimonies that emerged decades later, pieces of a puzzle that refused to stay buried. The Savannah Morning News carried a brief article on July 15, 1920, stating that the Willow Shade murder investigation had been resolved with the identification of a transient suspect who had subsequently died fleeing from authorities. No name was given, no body was ever produced. Sheriff Caldwell was mentioned as having resigned his position for health reasons. But there were witnesses to what actually happened, people who spoke only years later when they thought it was finally safe to reveal the truth. In 1956, a retired schoolteacher named Clara Brennan, living in a nursing home in Augusta, gave an interview to a local history student writing a thesis on forgotten Georgia communities. Clara had been 16 in 1920, Lucy Caldwell's best friend, the last person Lucy had planned to visit on that final morning. Clara's testimony, preserved in the student's notes now housed at the University of Georgia Library, provides a haunting glimpse of those final days. She described seeing Sheriff Caldwell on the morning of July 8th, walking toward the old Confederate cemetery alone, carrying no weapon, moving like a man in a trance. She and several other townspeople had followed at a distance, hiding among the trees that surrounded the graveyard. What they witnessed defied belief. Clara described a figure emerging from one of the old mausoleum crypts, tall, impossibly thin, dressed in what appeared to be clothes from another era. The figure's face was obscured by shadow even in broad daylight. Standing beside this figure, Clara swore was Lucy Caldwell, alive but transformed, her skin pale as bone, her eyes vacant. The conversation between Sheriff Caldwell and this entity lasted perhaps 15 minutes. Clara could not hear the words from her hiding place, but she saw her friend's father fall to his knees, saw him weeping, saw him reaching toward his daughter, who stood motionless, neither advancing nor retreating. Then, Clara stated, Dr. Holland arrived, with a group of armed men. Shots were fired. The tall figure moved with impossible speed, retreating into the crypt with Lucy. The men pursued. Clara heard screams from beneath the ground, sounds she described as not quite human. When the men emerged an hour later, they carried no bodies. They sealed the crypt entrance with bricks and mortar. They spoke to no one about what they had found below. Sheriff Caldwell left Willow Shade that same day. Clara never saw him again. In 1963, when portions of classified state records were released under new public disclosure laws, a letter surfaced that had been sent from Sheriff Caldwell to the Georgia governor in August 1920. The letter, written from an undisclosed location, requested that the town of Willow Shade be evacuated and the entire area, including all structures and the surrounding 5 square miles, be condemned and burned. The request was denied. Instead, state authorities quietly purchased most of the properties in Willow Shade over the following 3 years, relocating families under the pretense of a public health emergency. Contaminated groundwater was the official explanation. By 1925, Willow Shade existed only on old maps. In 1972, a graduate student in anthropology from Emory University named Robert Fisher obtained permission to conduct archaeological surveys of abandoned settlements in rural Georgia. His work in what remained of Willow Shade produced a series of disturbing photographs and field notes. Fisher's photographs show the ruins of the Baptist church, the collapsed remains of houses reclaimed by forest, and extensive excavations of the cemetery. His notes describe finding the sealed crypt that Clara Brennan had mentioned. Broken open from the inside, he noted the bricks scattered outward rather than inward. His team descended into tunnels beneath the crypt that connected to a larger network of passages. They found chambers containing human remains, 37 individuals in total, based on skeletal analysis, most dating to the mid-19th century, but several that carbon dating suggested were from the 1920s. All showed evidence of catastrophic trauma to the cervical vertebrae and skull base, consistent with what Fisher termed violent exsanguination procedures. Most significantly, they found additional journals, water-damaged and partially illegible, but clearly written after 1887. One fragment, photographed before it deteriorated completely, read, "The transformation is not complete. I can feel the sun's weakness, but also the hunger's strength. I have created vessels, 4 who will carry on when I must sleep. They will feed when I cannot. The town will sustain us for years. Then we will move on. We always move on." Fisher's research was never published. According to his colleagues, he suffered a severe psychological breakdown shortly after returning from Willow Shade and spent 6 months in psychiatric treatment. When he recovered, he refused to discuss his findings and destroyed most of his field notes. The photographs that survived were donated anonymously to the Georgia Historical Society in 1981. Perhaps the most disturbing evidence emerged in 1978 when a construction crew clearing land for a highway expansion near the old Willow Shade site discovered a concrete bunker buried 15 feet underground. Inside, they found a metal filing cabinet containing medical records from what appeared to be a clandestine government investigation conducted between 1923 and 1945. The documents, later partially released through Freedom of Information Act requests, revealed that federal health authorities had maintained covert surveillance of the Willow Shade area for more than 2 decades. They documented 43 unexplained deaths in surrounding counties between 1925 and 1944, all exhibiting characteristics similar to the 1920 murders. The investigation concluded in 1945 with a notation that the phenomena appear to have ceased or relocated beyond our surveillance capacity. One document in particular stands out, a sworn statement from Dr. Marcus Holland, dated December 1939, written shortly before his death from pneumonia. In it, he described the events of July 8, 1920, admitting that he and Sheriff Caldwell had found Lucy Caldwell alive in the tunnels beneath the cemetery, along with 3 other individuals who had been reported dead in previous weeks. All 4 showed signs of what Holland termed voluntary corruption. They were conscious, ambulatory, but exhibited an unnatural pallor and an apparent dependence on blood for sustenance. Holland's statement confirmed that he and Caldwell, along with several trusted men, had attempted to contain these individuals through physical restraint. The attempt failed catastrophically. 2 of Holland's companions were killed. The others fled. Lucy Caldwell and the 3 other transformed individuals disappeared into deeper tunnels that the searchers had not known existed. Holland wrote, "Sheriff Caldwell believed his daughter could be saved, could be returned to her former self. I knew even then that what we had encountered was beyond any medical intervention I could provide. We did not fight a disease. We fought something that had learned to mimic life while feeding upon it." The final fragment comes from the most unexpected source, a diary discovered in 2003 among the personal effects of Thomas Caldwell's great-granddaughter. The diary had been kept by Caldwell himself from 1920 until his death in 1954. Most entries dealt with mundane matters of his later life in Oregon, where he had relocated under an assumed name. But the entries from July 1920 provided the last piece of testimony from someone who was there. Caldwell wrote that Lucy had spoken to him in the cemetery, that she had been conscious and aware, but no longer his daughter in any meaningful sense. She told him that Dr. Blackwell's experiments had succeeded in ways the doctor himself had not fully understood. The transformation was not instantaneous but gradual, requiring the blood of the living and a willingness to surrender one's humanity. She told him that she had chosen this, that the whispers had promised escape from fear, from mortality, from the mundane limitations of existence. She told him that others had chosen it too, and that more would choose it in the future, because the hunger, once awakened in a place, never truly died. It only slept, waiting for new vessels. Caldwell's final entry about Willow Shade, dated July 20th, 1920, read, "I have failed as a lawman and as a father. I could not protect the innocent, and I could not save my own child from a fate I cannot even name without questioning my own sanity. The authorities will cover this up. They must, because to acknowledge what happened would be to admit that there are forces in this world that our laws and our science cannot touch. I leave Georgia knowing that whatever moved through Willow Shade may not be finished, that it may surface elsewhere in another town, another time. And I pray that whoever faces it next has the courage to do what I could not, to destroy it utterly, whatever the cost." Today, more than a century after the summer of 1920, the land where Willow Shade once stood remains largely abandoned. The Georgia Department of Natural Resources lists it as protected wetlands, officially off-limits to development. No historical markers commemorate what happened there. No memorial honors the victims. The town has been systematically erased from official history, appearing only in footnotes of obscure academic texts, and the fading memories of those whose grandparents whispered the stories they were told never to repeat. But erasure is not the same as resolution, and silence is not the same as truth. What really happened in Willow Shade during that terrible summer? After examining all the available evidence, the fragmented reports, the suppressed documents, the testimonies, given decades later, we are left with several possibilities, none of them entirely satisfying, all of them disturbing in their own ways. The first theory, the one favored by medical professionals and rational skeptics, suggests a serial killer with advanced medical knowledge. This individual, possibly someone who had discovered Dr. Blackwell's journals and laboratory, used the vampire mythology to create fear while conducting their own twisted experiments in exsanguination. The locked room mysteries could be explained by sophisticated lock-picking, the psychological control over victims by drugs or hypnosis. Lucy Caldwell's disappearance might have been a kidnapping that ended tragically, with authorities covering up their failure to save her. This theory has the advantage of remaining within the boundaries of known science, but it fails to explain the longevity of the phenomena, deaths continuing for decades after 1920, the multiple witnesses who described encounters with individuals they had seen buried, the government's sustained interest and surveillance through World War II. A single mortal killer cannot account for a quarter-century of unexplained deaths across multiple counties. The second theory proposes a cult, followers of Dr. Blackwell's philosophy who continued his work after his death, maintaining the underground facilities, recruiting new members through psychological manipulation, and using the vampire legend as cover for their activities. This would explain the persistence of the murders, the multiple individuals involved, and the eventual cessation of activity in the 1940s as the cult either disbanded or relocated. Perhaps Lucy Caldwell was not transformed into something inhuman, but rather indoctrinated into a group of fanatics who believed they were vampires. This theory has merit. History provides numerous examples of deadly cults sustained by charismatic leaders and shared delusions, but it struggles with certain medical facts. The complete exsanguination, without any blood evidence at death scenes, the precise surgical nature of the wounds, and the reported physical transformations witnessed by multiple credible observers, including law enforcement and medical professionals. The third theory is the one we are perhaps most reluctant to consider, the one that requires us to abandon our assumptions about what is and is not possible. This theory accepts the evidence at face value, that Dr. Silas Blackwell, through his decades of experimentation, discovered or created something that allowed certain individuals to transcend normal human biology, to sustain themselves through the consumption of blood, to exhibit capabilities that appear supernatural but might operate through biological mechanisms we do not yet understand. This theory suggests that Lucy Caldwell and others were not killed but transformed, that whatever Blackwell created can be transmitted or taught, that it may remain dormant in certain locations until circumstances allow it to emerge again. It is the theory that explains everything, and the theory that explains nothing, because it forces us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about life, death, and the boundaries of human existence. The truth is that we do not know. We may never know. The evidence is too fragmentary, too compromised by official suppression and the passage of time. What we do know is that something happened in Willow Shade in the summer of 1920, something terrible enough that the government chose to erase an entire town rather than acknowledge it publicly. And we know this: the land where Willow Shade stood is not entirely abandoned. Hikers who venture into that restricted wetland sometimes report finding old foundations hidden beneath the undergrowth, crumbling brick structures that might be wells or might be sealed tunnels. Some claim to feel watched in those ruins, to hear whispers when the wind is still, to see lights moving beneath the earth on moonless nights. In 2019, 2 college students on a camping trip near the old Willow Shade site reported encountering a woman in vintage clothing who warned them to leave before nightfall. When they asked if she lived nearby, she smiled and said she had lived there all her life. The students took her photograph. When they developed the image later, the woman did not appear, but the ruins behind where she had stood showed a faint glow in one window of a structure they swore had been empty moments before. Local. Rangers no longer patrol that area after dark. They won't say why. They don't have to. To this day, no one knows the complete truth of what happened in Willow Shade. Perhaps we are not meant to know. Perhaps some mysteries are warnings rather than puzzles to be solved. Reminders that the world contains depths our science has not plumbed, shadows our reason cannot illuminate. Before we close this case file, I want to hear from you, our haunted community. What do you believe happened in Willow Shade? Are you convinced by the rational explanations, or do you think something truly inexplicable walked those streets in 1920? Have you ever visited a place that felt wrong, where the past seemed to press against the present? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story has left you questioning the boundaries between history and horror, between the documented and the unexplainable, then please subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell. We journey into the darkest corners of forgotten American history every week, bringing you stories that the official record tried to bury. Until next time, remember, not all mysteries have solutions, and not all histories have happy endings. Some stories end not with answers, but with warnings. Stay curious, stay skeptical, but most of all, stay vigilant, because the darkness of the past is never as far behind us as we would like to believe.